Welcome. I'm Ngaire Crawford. I'm the Director of Insights at Isentia. I'm really pleased to be talking to you all today. Thank you for turning up on this wonderful day in November, which is AMEC Measurement Month. This is a month where we focus on education and best practice in communications, research and evaluation. For those of you that don't know me, I've been working in communications, media and audience research for over 20 years now, and I have always been really focused on how you can use data and evidence to change behaviour and perception, and whether that's internal and how you tell stories to your organisation, or if that's external and how you tell stories and be understood by your audiences. I have spent most of my career designing and building measurement strategies, measurement products and methodologies, either for wide-scale use, like what we do here at Isentia, or for individual organisations one-on-one. A quick little bit of housekeeping before we get into it too far. Please feel free to add any of your questions into the Q&A function. I have some very wonderful Isentians lurking in the background that will flag them to me as needed, or we'll be able to jump into them at the end. You'll also have a few polls that will pop up on your screen that will just help me get a bit of an understanding of where everyone is at, given that I don't have the opportunity in this session to see all of your wonderful faces and look at your reactions. And I'm also not, intimately knowledgeable of every organisation that is on this call, so I don't have those details around what it is that you do to measure KPIs or anything like that. So the session is actually something that our clients asked for, and I will jump into my slide deck shortly. But the biggest thing that was really interesting to me was the overwhelming choice that everyone had for a session that was about setting meaningful KPIs and how to measure them and tell your story internally. It's something that I very regularly am called on to workshop with clients individually, so it's exciting to be able to have this kind of a session with a broader audience. And the response to the survey that we sent out when we were coming up with the topic to this webinar, it told me two big things. One is that communicators continue to be really hungry for confidence. So not so much about collecting the data and having enough data, but really in understanding what it means and how to apply it and what's going to be the most impactful. And the other part is really just that we're well past the point where measurement is optional. It's very much the language of influence. It's necessary to be able to communicate in a way that gets you the results and the buy-in that you need from your organisation. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have a slightly more practical framework for setting KPIs that align to your organisational goals, ideas on how to turn what you already measure into more powerful insights, and some ways to tell your story with a bit more data. And the goal here is really to help you do that in a really clear and credible and confident way. The session will also be probably a balance of being practical, and also it will be a little bit honest, because I think, let's face it, most of us have had a measurement or research report land badly at least once. We've all presented key metrics and the room has gone a bit quiet, the email thread has died, you just get a thanks and not much else. And it's not necessarily because the work or the data wasn't good, it's just because we didn't translate it necessarily in the right way. So think of today as continuing to build on that ability to translate those stories to your organisation. So biggest foundational thing that we'll deal with first is a little bit about how we think on measurement itself. And we might jump into the very first poll actually, which is a little bit of a vibe check on what comes to mind when you hear the term KPI. So that should be launching for you in just a minute. There it goes. I don't think I've quite run the full spectrum of all possible reactions here, but I think it should give us a good view of how everybody's feeling about KPIs and what emotion it might muster in you. I might cut that poll off now so I can have a look at what the results look like. Cautious. That's a good emotion, I think. It's probably one that I hope I can help you out of and move you slightly more into confident. Amazing to see so many people feeling confident about KPI, KPI setting and what that feels like and being measured. That's always a big part of the focus often needs to be. How I will try and build this conversation a little bit is we will start in some foundational principles. They shouldn't be unfamiliar to you, but I think it's really important to make sure that we ground and then we build from there. Then we will go into a little bit more about KPIs and building good KPIs, move through to data storytelling. And then we'll probably end a bit on behaviors, what are good evaluation behaviors, what are not so good behaviors, and then hopefully have a bit of time for questions. So I think the biggest shift I've probably seen, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, is that previously the challenge I would always come up against as someone who spends so much time in this area is that communications functions didn't always measure. And that's not necessarily the case now. So it's not that people don't measure, it's that we're not always sure what the measurement is meant to mean, if that makes sense. Because measurement done really well will tell a story. It does connect to what you did, to what changed, and particularly why that change mattered, which is often the part that gets a little bit lost. So what we're looking for is how to build out measurement that shows contribution, not just activity, and because that's what will be the most powerful. That's when you can explain your impact most clearly and how you're moving from reporting to influencing. And is often one of the most powerful shifts that communicators can make because you're all phenomenal storytellers and you all live in narratives and perception, and not always is that same energy applied to how a measurement system or set of KPIs or campaign evaluation, how that story is told to the rest of your organization and what it means. So when you can sort of start to bring that expertise into how you tell those stories, it becomes really, really powerful and undeniable, which is always what we're looking for. I know we will have a mix of people in the session today, so I think I will try and structure examples, focus a little bit broadly on corporate, a little bit on government, and a little bit on not-for-profit. So when I use those terms, I am using them quite generally. So please do take from it what it is that makes the most sense to you and your organisation. The goals in those three styles of communication are obviously different, but the challenge is the same. So it's really how to make your work visible, valuable, and verifiable. So for some of you, that's going to be linking your PR and comms work to brand trust and reputation. For others, it's going to be about behavior change. It's going to be proving that communication actually influenced awareness, changed understanding, improved action. Or it could be showing how storytelling translated into advocacy or donations and not just purely impressions. So the good news is that all of these principles are quite universal. They're just different lenses on which you can apply them. But when I talk about the single biggest shift you can make to get your measurement working for you, it's moving from what we did to what we achieved. That's fundamentally the biggest shift. I think for a really long time in communications measurement, it's always been a celebration of what you did rather than necessarily what that achieved. So the reward has always been for the activity. It's been a celebration of output. So it's often been how much did we produce? How many stories ran? How many people did we reach? And that's worked for a long time because it feels very productive. You can always show volume. You can always prove that you're busy. Everyone loves a big number on a slide, especially a number that continues to go up. The problem here is that activity doesn't necessarily equal impact. You can have a really significant campaign, millions of impressions, and it still might not shift what actually matters, if that's trust or behavior particularly. So it's that little shift of look at everything we did to did it actually work? And that is a crucial part of storytelling within your organization as well, because as soon as you can start making that shift away from purely being about activity and effort and moving into results, that's really how you're going to get that, particularly leadership buy-in, if it's a board level buy-in, or that external buy-in as well, being able to really understand the impact that you have. And obviously communicators, perfect position to show that, because what communications already does is connect directly to understanding perception and trust. It just also needs to be measured that way. So a terminology that I'm sure you have heard before is this movement from vanity metrics to value metrics. And I say vanity metrics loosely. It's often more equated with AVEs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about AVEs specifically because we will be spending more time in metrics that are about impact and value, and that's not necessarily what that metric will do. What we really need to move away from is things that are comfortable. Comfortable metrics is probably a better terminology than vanity. They're quite easy to report. They sound very impressive. Nobody asked too many questions. Reach, likes, share a voice. They're all indicators, but they don't really tell a full story. What you really need is moving into value metrics, and this is by far not an exhaustive list of value metrics. There are many, and a lot of them should tie back to what metrics are the most important to your organization, which we will also get to in a minute as well. But you want to be able to show progress against purpose. So if your organization's goal is trust, then your measurement needs to tell that trust story. If it's behavior change, your measurement needs to track intent or action. If it's efficiency, your measurement should show how communications might have helped save time. They might have reduced confusion or improved internal alignment. And it's those connections that help make measurement a bit more strategic. So for example, if I was taking a corporate view on this, instead of looking at the number of mentions in maybe media or social conversation, that would be a shift to a share of positive message among outlets that are really relevant to our investors. And mostly what that tiny little flip is that you stop focusing on being loud, but you start focusing on being a respected voice. So those are tiny little frame flips. For a more government organisation, it might be instead of number of, again, mentions of a particular policy or engagement strategy or community outreach event, and shift that to something around the percentage of citizens who might correctly understand a new policy, because that's less about exposure and that's actually about comprehension. And for that final view of, if I was looking from a not-for-profit perspective, instead of number of posts or increase in followers, what I would shift to is more that increase in donor retention after some impactful storytelling. So that's when you're looking at not so much the noise, but about that loyalty amongst your audience. So it's still the same style of activity. It's just a different lens and connection to the rest of the organization. So one of the big things here as well is understanding how to measure what it is that you influence and not what you can't control. I think one of the first statements I often make when redesigning KPIs with clients is just to really understand what they feel like is in their control. And it's in this control sometimes where communicators will particularly get stuck. How do you show value when there's a whole bunch of things that aren't in your control? And again, it is a slight shift. So it's moving away from these are the metrics that are about me to being about how you can demonstrate your contribution. So we can't necessarily control sales or legislation or donors, but you can contribute to the things that might make someone pick up a phone, tick a box, make a donation. You contribute to those things. So that's the link that we want to be able to make. You can't force behavior, but you can influence awareness and intent. You don't control a customer's decision, but you absolutely shape trust and credibility. So that is really what good measurement is going to capture. It's going to capture that contribution, not be stuck in the areas that you feel like are exclusively under your control. When you stop trying to, I guess, own that final number and instead show the part where you influenced, that's actually where you become more credible, not less credible. So you shift from supporting to enabling is really what we're looking at. And sometimes that, from a measurement perspective, is where you can get a little bit tied down by whose metrics are what. And one of the areas to be cautious of and to always focus on when you are looking at contribution and your influence on overall business objectives is making sure that you do know the difference between credible contribution and overclaiming something. So what you actually want to show is the link between the things and not a leap that you necessarily directly solved the world's problems. You want to demonstrate correlation and contribution rather than that sole level of success. And the more that you can do that, and the more that you can incorporate other data sets, the more powerful those stories become. So I think the big thing to focus on here is always be conscious of what it is that you feel like you do contribute to. And those can be quite broad organisational objectives, and we will go into some of those shortly. But another little point on language in this session is you will hear me talk about outputs, outcomes, and impact a lot. These are not it's not terminology exclusive to me by any means. There are a ton of really great frameworks if you want to look into that style of definition and measurement and segmentation more deeply. AMAC has a really amazing integrated framework that you can use that actually has slightly more sections than that. But I find these three definitions of outputs, outcomes, and impact the easiest way to contextualize and often visualize things. So really just outputs are what you did, outcomes are what changed, and impact are why it mattered. So it's just to constantly remind yourself that if you're only going to measure your outputs, all you're ever going to do is record history, which is really valuable. We all know history is valuable. But ultimately, if you start measuring your outcomes and link them to the impact, that's where you're actually going to shape strategy. So ultimately, trying to move everybody into a more confident space here. I know that there's probably some of you that will be thinking, this is all cool, this sounds great, but I still work in a place where we have to justify our existence every quarter. And I get that, I see that a lot. And that's why that confidence matters so much. The moment that you can say, here's what we aim to influence, here's how we measured it, and here's what changed, you shift from like really defensive reporting to that more strategic storytelling. So it's not that reactionary defensive position of, was this even worth it? And you shift that conversation to what it is that we should do next. So Before moving to the next part more specifically about KPIs, just to summarize this really easily, outputs show effort, outcomes are going to show effect. Vanity metrics will always make you look busy. Value metrics are what make you look strategic. You also don't need to prove that you controlled everything. Really focus on what you contributed to meaningfully. So I think it might be time to load up our next poll, which is just a quick view of what your current approach to reporting might be. And again, it won't be an exhaustive list. It's just to give me a quick little check on how people are currently reporting, what your approach is. Hopefully that poll will be coming up in a second. What we will move into in this next section is a little bit more about KPI setting. Again, everyone does this a little bit differently, so do take the principles that make the most sense to you. It looks like we might be having a little bit of an issue with that poll, so we can just keep moving. We'll just keep moving through. I've got more polls, don't worry. We've talked a lot about mindset. I think that mindset thing is really important because it helps you. Oh, there is our poll now. Mindset is super important because it does help ground anything practical. So the next section will really look at how you set KPIs that matter. And again, the caveat of being every organisation does this a little bit differently. Some are really amazing at having clear frameworks and linking everything back to performance. Some are a little more loose and you've got to figure out what you're doing and what makes the most sense. Sometimes you're the one that's asked what your KPIs should be. Sometimes you are told. So those are all important contextual points here. Let's see what those poll results are. Oh, interesting. For what we did, for what we achieved, do both but not consistently. That is a really, I think, one of the most interesting challenges that often happens in communications measurement. Sometimes we are really good at really deep reporting on one thing once. It's the consistency that is tricky, and it's how you translate that same energy and narrative approach and enthusiasm for learning into your actual really regular KPIs, if they're monthly, quarterly, annual, whatever it is that makes sense. So taking some of that campaign energy into BAU. So KPI frameworks. There's a bunch of different ways that you can look at KPIs. There's SMART frameworks. There's a whole series of acronyms. I'm just going to walk through what I tend to look at when designing communications KPIs specifically. So the big thing is you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need massive dashboards. You don't need 40 different metrics. What you need is structure. And again, it's that link back to storytelling. So something that will help you define what success really looks like before you start measuring it. So that very first one, they're identifying an organisational goal. Can sound a little bit abstract, but if you remember nothing else from this session, one of the things that I would really love for you to take away is just like that should be the anchor point regardless. And you can start really massive. You can start existential if you want to. You can start with a why are we here, and sort of move backwards. Typically, when I see people struggling with KPIs, it's because they've come at them the other way of starting with the activity and then trying to link it to an organizational goal rather than going backwards. So that is often where a KPI might fail because it's started in the wrong place. So the discussion might look more like, well, we need KPIs for this campaign, and then everyone starts figuring out what things you're going to count. And that's where you end up with your clicks and your mentions and your attendance and all of those things that you can count. And you'd not necessarily ask the question of like, well, why are we doing this in the first place? What is the purpose of this activity? Why are we communicating about this at all? Um, and all of those organizational goals or objectives would ideally link to, it could be a measurable metric that your organization already cares about. That could be, if you're in a more corporate environment, there might be brand trust or reputation. It could be, public understanding or compliance or social license. If you're in a more government space, for not-for-profits, that might be advocacy, awareness, or just, straight financial figures around donation and retention of donors. But ultimately, if you're not connecting to that organizational goal, it's just going to look like activity and potentially busy work. I think one of the best audiences to think about, and I don't know how popular this idea would be with them, but if you think about whether or not, if you put a metric or a KPI in front of a CFO, could they understand it without context? That's often a really effective way of thinking, oh, okay, so I need to make it clear as to what this contribution is and why this is important. So before you think about the actual measurable bits, start with that purpose. The alignment that's important here is understanding, again, going back to that idea of control. So what it is that you directly influence, inputs, your content, your quality, your message consistency, and then the things that you actually would influence more than you control. So what are you helping to change? The awareness, trust, engagement, sentiment, reputation, those types of metrics. Now, mapping the measurement story is often where things become really overcomplicated. This is simply connecting what it is that you have done to what it is that has changed. So if you think of it like a straight line, so if you have the outputs, outcomes, impact, right at the beginning is your inputs. It's just a very straight line. Your inputs become your outputs, then move to outcomes, and then to impact. So those inputs are going to be your planning, your resources, what it is that goes in, your team's time, your budget, your content, your partnerships, making sure that you operationalize the value of your team and your staff and your activity. So something that often I find is missed is that operational lens is not necessarily applied. Understanding what your team's time is worth to the business, and what different activities cost your business, and what the return on that activity is, can often be a more powerful way of presenting value than necessarily only in those output metrics. The other important parts here are really that, outputs are what you actually produce. So your inputs turn into outputs. Outcomes are what changes as a result, and then impact is that big picture. So what behavior or business results. So again, that idea of you don't own the impact exclusively or directly, but you contribute to it. So what we want to measure is those steps that led to that business impact. So if we take an example like maybe a government department runs an emergency preparedness campaign, and your input was the input into the creative development, and you ran the media campaign and the media briefings and the community engagement. Your outputs might be 400 media items, some social campaign, some social campaign metrics, and a series of community briefings would be the outputs. Your outcome might be that in all of that activity, your message recognition rose from 40% to 70%. The impact metric here would be around, as a result or during this window of a campaign, during this window of activity, there may have been a 10% increase in households with emergency kits during that window. So while you can't take credit for the emergency kits, you don't know exactly why people have made that decision, you can certainly prove that your communications enabled and supported that result. to use that as a hopefully a helpful example. When you are writing the KPI, and I'm conscious that my slides are quite text heavy, but that is purposeful, and that I hope that they will be really helpful to you when we send them out afterwards, and you don't have to skip through quite so many. The getting down to writing the KPI, this is sometimes where you can have done all of that thinking, but then don't actually structure it into the KPI itself. So the formula that you want to use is something that's very simple and specific and aligned to what it is that you can influence. The way that I tend to look at this is action, influence, context, and time frame. So that would be, what it is that you want to change or achieve. What's the metric that shows that progress? Who or what does it apply to? And when should it happen? So time bound, we know, is always super important when you're setting anything, or otherwise it can go on forever. It might be taking that structure as an example, could be that you want to increase message understanding among regional audiences from 45 to 65% by June 2026. So that's clear, time bound, and tells a story. And that statement in itself is an easier step and an easier feed into what would be an organisational objective. Making sure that those two things will always link is really crucial here as well. Ultimately, I think, if you can't quite visualize how you're going to report on something, it's probably not the right KPI. Some common traps that people fall into when writing KPIs in communication, particularly, and if you're in an environment where there's not a lot of pressure or structure associated with your KPIs. One of them is vague KPIs, or what I like to call quite wishful KPIs. So one of those might be generating world-class awareness, which is great. That's a really lovely sentiment, but you cannot measure that. You can't measure what the definition of world-class awareness might be. And a vague KPI might be that you can improve engagement, which is great. But again, improve it by how much? Who are you improving it for? When are you improving it by? And then there's often a reactive KPI, which is just you use what you've got. Report on what's available. And again, that's not really measurement as much as it is record keeping, unless you do have a lot of great data at your fingertips, which you might. And there's always a way to tell a story. But the mindset that you need is how to tailor this specifically for what it is that you want to measure, rather than just, well, I've got this metric, so how do I put it into this thing that I want to say? Ultimately, and I think you can all appreciate the sentiment, but typically if something sounds like spin, it's probably going to be received that way as well. These are just some quick examples of what this might look like across sectors. And again, these are quite broad. They would be different for your specific organisation, but just a little bit of a flash on the language that you might use. So they are designed to be a little bit more focused. So ultimately, it's that kind of focus that shifts you from performance theatre is often what it is, where you've got a lot of KPIs, aren't really saying anything. And the other part to KPI measurement that people are often quite concerned about is an expectation that all KPIs are there to be smashed. And they aren't, and that's okay. In fact, typically the best measurement cultures are the ones that they're not trying to chase metrics, they are trying to chase that learning. So if you miss a KPI, it's still going to tell a really good story. It's going to tell you what to change, where to focus, what to try next. And the benefit of that is that it's also going to tell that to everybody else in your organisation, where you can provide that context. Really, we're looking for progress. These things are never actually perfection. So something that's super crucial for measurement and KPI setting, the ability to turn your activity into data that you can use. So how do you also take the stuff that you do every day and turn it into data that actually means something and you can show that contribution that you're making? Um, and stop you having to cry into a spreadsheet at 10 o'clock at night, which is something I'm sure we've all done. Um, so let's look at how you might turn some of these things into measurable value. You want to be able to take the data that you already have, and communicators collect an incredible amount of data. You have, you might have media coverage, you might have engagement metrics, event attendance, survey responses, downloads, reaches, impressions, all of those things. It's all there. So it often, as I was saying earlier, it's not that you don't have the data, it's that it's just not necessarily translated, or the story's not told in the right way. So moving on to storytelling a little bit. Some of this can start with those easy upgrades from what we did to what we achieved. So elevating, elevating your measurement doesn't actually require a bunch of sophisticated tools or massive budgets. It can be the reframe of those existing metrics, um, and tell that more complete story. So don't stop at activity level. Make sure you're thinking about quality and outcome and impact. And the payoff is significant when you can invest that time to structure it that way. I think the other part of this is that sometimes the best evidence actually doesn't live with you. It can absolutely live in somebody else's spreadsheet. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of a data scavenger hunt. It's being able to look at the information that's within your organization, build those relationships with the other departments, understand how, and take them on the journey of how what you want to measure is also beneficial to them, and ensuring that you can get that more holistic view so that you can start to bring in other parts of data that might demonstrate your contribution rather than necessarily only the metrics that you own. So make sure you go on that data scavenger hunt. It's always worthwhile. And also, if there's a lot of different ways that you can look to incorporate data, you may find insights teams within other departments that are using media data in a funny way. You might find that they're trying to make two and two together about communications, but they're missing context. It's always really helpful to align on data. So being able to tell a story with data, I think the challenge that sometimes happens here is we often equate storytelling with data visualization, and those two things are not necessarily the same. So what's particularly important is that it's not about the decoration. It's actually about being able to tell your story with a level of clarity, and logic and relevance. So clarity in this context doesn't mean drowning people in data. You're really using clarity to anchor to what's the problem that you solved. Logic here just means showing that link between what it is that you did and what changed, building that bridge that we've been talking about between your actions and your organization's goals. And relevance is just making sure that it matters to the people that are in front of you. So making sure that you doing the communications positioning on what it is that you are measuring to the rest of your organization. So one of the things that is a challenge when you are reporting to, and I say the term boardroom loosely, I think you can sub this out for any kind of leadership forum that makes the most sense to your organization. But it's ultimately about storytelling upwards to senior leaderships, boards, executives, And this is where measurement can really lose momentum. And absolutely, again, not because the data isn't good, but it is not necessarily presented in the way that makes the most sense to that audience. And I think what's often missed, and people get stuck in that idea of activity, if I need to show that we've been doing a bunch of things, and that's not what they are most interested in. They are typically interested in the insight that you get from having done all those things. So it's not, they don't necessarily want that recap, want that reason, like why did you undertake that activity? How effective was it? What does that mean that we do next? Challenge here is often that they don't necessarily know that you could communicate it in that way. So they don't ask you to do it, or they don't require it and filter it back down. So sometimes that is a bit of a journey to take them on in terms of what it is that makes the most sense for that audience to engage with them, and be open to that dialogue and that greater level of transparency with what it is that you're trying to achieve. So a quick example here would be one team that I worked with open the monthly report that they were producing for the board with just media reach. So you'd have, millions of impressions, hundreds of stories, and sounds super impressive, but wasn't really of interest. It was just something that got flicked through, was just another metric on a page. One of the shifts that they made was changed that positioning to be about what media coverage told them about trust. The same data, still just media coverage, but it was a different frame. So this went as far as not only what does the media coverage tell us about trust, but this was an organisation that were heavily embedded with reputational metrics. They really lived and died by their RepTrak scores and rankings. So being able to map their media coverage to that framework was the thing that made the most sense to that audience. But we didn't really know that until we spent time probing what wasn't necessarily working and why they weren't engaged with it, and showing them a bunch of options. So it was just that single flip, still the same metric, just mapped differently. In another example with a not-for-profit, one of the things that they would be really focused on was growing audience and increasing follower counts on own channels, increasing media penetration. Again, just more metrics that didn't necessarily land, like not bad metrics, all true, all evidence of work going on, but not resonating with their leadership in a way that meant that they were getting buy-in or were able to be involved in strategic conversations. That frame was changing it away from audience growth and moving it into donor confidence. And that was just using data they had, working out a way of measuring, having a score that indicated donor confidence. So, and within maybe a couple of quarters, it was the donor confidence that became the number that the board asked for first. And because that was something that translated past communications, it wasn't purely about communications. That's about the health of their organisation. And again, it spoke that language of value and not necessarily just about activity. And I would really encourage you to think about that broader organisational view in more detail. It's a very similar through line between how you might set a measurement framework, how you might design KPIs, and then also how you actually prepare business cases within an organisation. So often the same structure is all using the same muscle for different movements. So the more you build strength in them, the better you get at all of them, which is always a huge benefit. Just to quickly recap, I want to be able to anchor some of this to behaviours, just so that you can either recognise behaviour that might not be the right way to approach something, and we can celebrate good behaviour and call it out, and give people something to strive for, or celebrate that it's something that they already do. I think we might have another poll about measurement mistakes. So while that one gets popped up. So there it is. Beautiful. I might just talk through what some of these things are. We've talked a lot about like what good measurement looks like in quite broad terms. So some of the stuff that can get in the way of this, retrofitting KPIs is a big one. I also have a lot of fun in my life as an awards judge for PR awards and research awards as well. And this is the one that I see the most. You finish a campaign, you look at what performed really well, and then you suddenly decide what your KPIs were at the start. A little bit like marking the exam after you've already seen the answers. And I would say that I think this doesn't land as well as people think that it does. Like it's often really obvious that that's what has happened. Um, One of the ones I see in communications awards the most is we set that the metric was set at we are going to get 15 stories. We're going to get 15 news stories. And there's like, oh, we got 300 news stories. If you got 300 and you set 15, it's highly likely that what you set was not right in the first place, or feels very much like potentially that's been used to help that result look even better. It's not really something that you're going to necessarily learn from or demonstrate value. So again, like setting those KPIs before you start, even when they aren't perfect. The other one is really you can set the bar really low and accept a lot of poor metrics. So the results of that poll, reliance on outdated metrics is the highest. I love that. I think that's probably a really important point. Everyone needs to do a solid audit of both the information that you are using and how you collect it, but also what else you might have access to and what you might be able to swap out. Thank you all for that. That's really interesting. Not too many admissions of setting KPIs after the campaign, but there was a few in there. So thank you for being honest about that too. So setting the bar really low, making things that are technically achievable, but not really meaningful. So things it could be I delivered 3 press releases this quarter, or published 4 social posts a week. Things like that are not linked to activity. And ultimately, like if you start to overperform on low KPIs, you do put yourself in a scenario where people may not trust the data that you're using. Ultimately, I come at this from an analyst perspective. I certainly do that. If everything's always at 120%, are we actually measuring performance, or are we just, we're just measuring ourselves on something that could make you look good? So KPIs should always stretch you. Even if you need to segment it in a way that you are being clear about what's stretch and what's not, you should always aim to stretch and learn something. Another big one is not challenging poor metrics. And I think when you think about that board and leadership discussion, these two things often go hand in hand, because of what I really mean here is I think the biggest wall that sometimes I hit in discussions with communicators about evaluation is, yeah, that's nice. That sounds really good. But my CEO only cares about AVs. They only want me to report that way. That's how we report to the business. It's how we've always reported to the business. And I get that. That is a hard challenge. The problem is the more that we don't offer alternatives, and the more that we don't continually try and have this active discussion around what the right kind of metrics are and that link to business objectives, we reinforce the idea that that's like it's good enough. And it's a challenge to be able to really demonstrate your value and be included in conversations that are strategic and relevant to your organization, if those are the things that we're using. So having the courage to kind of retire bad metrics is super important, and being a challenger in that space as well. The other one that I would really quickly add in here that I've not put on the slide is skipping pre-research and context. only using data when you're using it to measure something that's already happened and not using it to position and design what it is that you're going to do. That's always something that is really relevant. Just conscious of time. I might flip to behaviors of great measurement. Super easy to understand. I've spoken about most of them so far in this session. Find the right data, scavenge for it, beg for it, buy people a lot of coffees to be able to access it. Be collaborative. I think co-design is something that I really enjoy as a communications activity. I think to bring that same lens and energy into how you might design your measurement and your KPIs. Your activity into evidence, always focus on impact and write to your organization. Take that business case mindset into how it is that you want to frame what it is that you're doing. And certainly don't sleep on when you're turning your activity into evidence, making sure that you operationalize your time and your team's time, and keeping that as a metric that you can use. Very, very quickly, these are some of the research tools that I think help build real insight. You don't need all of them. You might need some of them. They might be some things inside your organization, some things that aren't, but this is just a very quick guide to the ones that I think are really helpful from a data richness perspective. And ultimately, sometimes these conversations, depending on where you're starting, feel really big. You can start small and you can start now. I like to think about, what would I want you to do tomorrow, or this afternoon, depending on how keen you are to get on with your day. Just pick one thing and keep moving. Pick one KPI to improve. Pick your weakest one you don't like, the one you think that isn't as relevant as it could be. Find another data set, any data set within your organization, and see if it could give you that link between what it is that you contribute to and the business outcome. And just, how could you tell a better story? One of my favorite things to do, which just exposes the level of nerdiness that I have, is not only auditing metrics, but auditing that storytelling. From an objective perspective, if I was looking at an organization and looking at your measurement, what am I telling? What's the story that I'm telling now? What's the story I actually want to tell? And then what sits in the middle? There's a lot of things we haven't necessarily covered today. What I've not really addressed, and I would like to in a future session, if people have enjoyed this one, is really around what's next for measurement, what's changing, what's coming, what you should be paying attention to if you want to stay ahead. With the role of AI is really starting to shape how communicators do their job. It's also massively changing how we're doing our jobs. Data is becoming more and more accessible. Some of it is amazing. Some of it is absolute snake oil. We're in the very messy beginning of an industry that can massively elevate the work and how you communicate about it. I have many thoughts about it, but I will probably save them for another session if people are interested. I hope that ultimately the initial theme that I touched on when I opened the session, which was really about confidence, that I hope that this is something that some of the information is here is what can help build up your confidence to, ask for resources and push back on unrealistic expectations, confidence to say, here's what we achieved and here's what we're going to do next. And that confidence is massively going to change how you show up in any room, and how you can lead a conversation, which is always going to be the aim here. And really, if there's one thing I would like you to take from it, it's that best measurement stories are very much not about what happened. They are fundamentally about what happens next. And if you bring that energy into into all of that measurement approach. That'll be really helpful to what it is that you want to achieve. I can see that there are a number of questions in the chat as well as the QA. So I know we have time for a few very quick questions. And a question from Amelia is, what are your tips for helping bring the organisation along when rewriting KPIs? I think take that co-design and collaboration mindset into it. One of the things I've learned the most about KPI writing is looking at everybody else's KPIs if they're comfortable with it and how they structure them. So even understanding how an operational team structures their KPIs, what data they use, and having that similar through line and connection points, depending on what part of an organization you fit into, is often the other element here. The things that are the most powerful, and telling that story around, we want to design our metrics around impact. This is what we believe impact to be. Here's how we believe we contribute, and here's what we think. So that kind of consultative and collaborative focus that I know is so core to communications is actually really helpful in this space as well. Next week, in the spirit of AMAC Measurement Month, I am also running a measurement mentor week. So my diary is open for some limited one-on-one sessions. If there's anything in this session that you've enjoyed and want to apply, but you're not sure where to start, if you have questions about measurement at all, if you would just like a really nerdy chat about charts, anything you like, you'll get sent a link to sign up to those if that's of interest to you. They are limited. I am a little bit limited by time, but certainly another way to get in contact with me is if you are an Isentia client, please get in touch with your account management team, and they can always connect us at some stage. And please follow me on LinkedIn as well. That's often where you can find me in all of my various measurement states of rent.